I'm Judy Brewster and I was 33 the night my parents decided I wasn't worth the drive. Black ice on Route 15. That's all it took. 1 second I was humming along to the radio on my way home for Thanksgiving. Headlights cutting through sleep, and the next second my Camry hit the guardrail at 52 mph and folded around me like a crushed can. 4 broken ribs, a lacerated spleen, internal bleeding bad enough that the trauma surgeon opened me up for 6 hours while I was somewhere between a live and not. When I woke up, the recovery room was empty. No flowers on the nightstand, no jacket draped over the chair, just fluorescent light, a heart monitor beeping, and a whiteboard where someone had written family notified declined to come. The charge nurse told me later gently, the way you tell someone their dog didn't make it. She'd called my mother at 6:00 a.m. my mother's answer. A sentence I will carry in my chest longer than the scars was, "This will come if she dies." But here's what none of them knew. Not my mother, not my father, not my sister who was too busy basting a turkey to pick up the phone. There was a man in a black jacket who walked into that hospital, paid my entire bill in cash, and left a cedar box wrapped in brown paper at the nurse's station with a single instruction. Don't open it until you get home. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary people meet impossible family moments and walk out with their dignity whole. If you've ever shown up for everybody and got nothing back, this one's for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. Let me back up. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving, I'd just come off a double shift in the pediatric ICU at St. Anne's. 12 hours of monitoring a 4-year-old on a ventilator, then 12 more covering for a colleague who called in sick. My neck hurt. My scrub smelled like antiseptic, and the vending machine coffee I'd spilled on myself at 3:00 a.m., but I packed my overnight bag anyway because I'd promised my mother I'd make the drive to Dunor for the holiday. 3 hours on Route 15 through the Alleghenies. I'd done it dozens of times. The sleet started near Lewisburg. I dropped my speed to 40, then 35. The wipers slapped. The road turned silver. And then nothing. No warning. The rear tires broke loose on a patch of black ice, and the car swung sideways into the guardrail with a sound like a giant crumpling tinfoil. I remember the airbag hitting my face. I remember a rib snapping, a deep, wet pop that I felt more than heard. After that, just cold air rushing in through the shattered window and the taste of copper on my tongue. The paramedics told me later I was conscious when they cut me out, but I don't remember any of it. I woke up 20 hours later in a hospital bed at Gissinger. A drainage tube in my side, an IV in each arm, and a pain in my rib cage so sharp that every breath felt like swallowing glass. I turned my head to look at the chair beside the bed. Empty. I checked my phone on the tray table. No missed calls, no texts, just a lock screen photo of me and my mother from 2 Christmases ago. Both of us smiling like we meant it. The charge nurse, a woman named Dana with reading glasses on a beaded chain, came in to check my vitals around noon. She adjusted my morphine drip, scanned my chart, and then sat on the edge of the bed. The way nurses do when they're about to say something that isn't medical. "Your family knows you're here," she said. "I called the number in your emergency contacts at 6 this morning." It waited. Dana looked at the chart again, then at me. "Your mother said they were hosting Thanksgiving dinner. She said they'd come if things got worse." She picked her words carefully, but I'd been a nurse for 9 years. I could hear the redaction. What exactly did she say, Dana? Dana exhaled. She said, "We'll come if she dies." The sentence landed like a second crash. I replayed it later, lying in the dark, because replaying was easier than feeling. The doctor, a trauma surgeon named Ackafer, had written it in my chart under the family contact section. Family notified 6:05. Declined to attend. Patient stable post-op. That was me, stable post-op. Not worth the 3-hour drive on a holiday when there was a turkey in the oven and guests arriving at noon. I stared at the ceiling and did what I'd always done. I calculated. My mother had a 24-seat dining table she'd bought on credit the year my sister Megan got engaged. Megan's fiancé's parents were coming. Megan's college friends. Megan Skarker, who brought the good wine. There was no seat at that table for a daughter with a drainage tube and a morphine drip. There never really had been. The next question came slowly. The way fog rolls. If my family didn't pay the hospital bill, who did? I should tell you who I am because it matters for what comes next. I'm a pediatric ICU nurse at St. Anne's Children's Hospital in Harrisburg. I hold other people's children when they code. I talk parents through the worst nights of their lives while their toddler is on a ventilator and the monitors are screaming and the attending hasn't come out of the O yet. I've done that for 9 years. I am very, very good at staying calm. I'm also very good at being the one who stays behind. Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's. I volunteered for every holiday shift because somebody had to. And my family never complained when I couldn't make it. They never complained because they preferred it. Megan was the daughter who showed up with flowers and a casserole and the right shade of lipstick. I was the daughter who showed up with dark circles and scrub-top lint in her hair and a phone that buzzed during grace. My mother once introduced me to a neighbor as our other one. She works with sick kids. Bless her heart. Bless her heart. If you've spent any time in small-town Pennsylvania, you know that phrase isn't a blessing. Somewhere in my 20s, I stopped expecting the front row seat. I stopped expecting the phone call on my birthday that came before 10:00 a.m. I stopped expecting my mother to ask how my shift went. I didn't resent it exactly. I just recalibrated. I'm a PICU nurse. Recalibrating is what I do. You assess the vitals. You accept the data. You adjust the plan. The data said you are not the priority, so I adjusted. I worked holidays. I covered doubles. I built a life that didn't need their approval. And I told myself that was enough. It almost was. On my second day in the hospital, a patient services clerk named Lorena knocked on my door. She was maybe 55, silver hair pinned back, reading glasses perched on her nose, carrying a clipboard in one hand and a small rectangular package in the other. The package was wrapped in brown craft paper tied with white kitchen string. The kind of wrapping that looked like it belonged on a care package from 1962, not a modern hospital. Miss Brewster, she stepped in and set the package on my tray table. A gentleman dropped this off for you yesterday evening. Tall, older, black wool jacket. She glanced at her clipboard. He also settled your account. I blinked. My account, your hospital bill, surgery, anesthesia, the room, all of it paid in full. She said it the way you'd say someone brought you a casserole. Matter of fact, routine. But there was nothing routine about a stranger walking into a hospital and paying a bill that had to be north of $80,000. He left a message, Lorraine added. He said, and I wrote it down because it seemed important. Tell her not to open it until she gets home. I stared at the package. It was the size of a shoe box, heavier than it looked. When I lifted it, the paper crinkled, and underneath I caught a faint smell. Cedar, like the inside of a hope chest, like my grandfather's workshop, which I hadn't thought about in years. Did he leave a name? Lorraine shook her head. Just the jacket and the instructions. She left. I held the box for a long time, running my thumb along the string. My ribs screamed every time I shifted, and the cedar smell kept drifting up like a question I wasn't ready to answer. They discharged me on Friday afternoon, 2 days after the crash, 1 day after Thanksgiving. Nobody from my family came to pick me up. My coworker, Renata, drove 45 minutes from Harrisburg in her Subaru with the heated seats and the bumper sticker that said, "Nurses do it with gloves on." She brought me a turkey sandwich from Wawa and didn't ask a single question about why my mother wasn't there. That's the thing about ER nurses. We know when not to ask. My apartment was cold when we got there. I'd left in a hurry Wednesday night and forgot to turn the heat up. Renata helped me inside, adjusted my sling, set my discharge meds on the counter, and microwaved a mug of broth because I couldn't lift my arm high enough to reach the microwave buttons. Every time I laughed at one of her jokes, my ribs punished me. A hot, grinding ache that radiated from my left side all the way into my shoulder blade. Sharper now than in the hospital because I'd cut my morphine dose in half out of habit. The cedar box sat on my kitchen counter where Renata placed it. She'd carried it in from the car without comment. It looked wrong there between the toaster and the fruit bowl, too solemn for a Formica countertop. "You going to open that?" Renata asked, pulling on her coat. I shook my head. "Not yet." She didn't push. She just hugged me carefully, the way you hug someone whose ribs are held together with surgicalware, and left. The apartment went quiet. I sat at the table with my broth and stared at the box and thought about the number on my hospital bill, $82,400. Somebody had written a check for that. Somebody in a black jacket who smelled like cedar. Saturday morning. The phone rang for the first time since the crash. Not a text, not a notification, an actual call. I didn't recognize the number. A 570 area code. "Scranton, Miss Brewster. My name is Daniel Frost. I'm an estate attorney with Frost & Associates in Dunner." I sat up too fast and my ribs reminded me not to do that. "I'm calling about your grandfather, Walter Brewster." I hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in years. 16 years to be exact. Walter Brewster. My father's father. The man my mother had cut out of our lives when I was 17. The year I started applying to nursing schools. The year my grandfather stopped appearing at holidays, stopped calling, stopped existing in our family's vocabulary as anything other than a cautionary tale my mother told at dinner parties. "Your grandfather passed away," Frost said 3 weeks ago quietly at home. "Per his instructions, I'm reaching out to you now." 3 weeks. My grandfather had been dead for 3 weeks and nobody told me. Not my father, whose father he was. Not my mother, who apparently had time to plan a 24-seat Thanksgiving, but not 30 seconds to pick up the phone and say, "Your grandfather is gone." "Mr. Frost," I said, "I haven't spoken to my grandfather since I was 17. I'm aware of that. He said your grandfather was too. He was also aware that you'd be the last to know." There was a pause. Then he asked me to mention the box. The cedar box was still on my kitchen counter, untouched, the string still tied. "I'd like to meet with you in person, Miss Brewster. There are documents you'll need to see, and a few things your grandfather wanted you to understand before anyone else contacts you about his estate." Anyone else? He meant my parents. I met Daniel Frost the following Tuesday at his office on Main Street in Dunor. A narrow brick building with a brass name plate and a waiting room that smelled like old leather and lemon furniture polish. Frost was in his late 60s, lean, precise, with silver hair combed straight back and reading glasses he kept folding and unfolding while he talked. He wore a black wool jacket, the same jacket Lorraine described. "I've been your grandfather's attorney for 23 years, he said, settling behind his desk. "I drafted his will. I managed his trust. And for the last 16 years, I've been the person he spoke to most about you." I set the cedar box on the desk between us, still wrapped, still tied. Frost looked at it the way you look at a letter you've been waiting to deliver for a long time. "You were the first person I called after Walter died," he said. "Not your father. That was Walter's instruction. Written, notarized." He opened a manila folder. "Your grandfather established a revocable trust in 2011. He funded it with the proceeds from the sale of his machine shop, his savings, and a rental property in Scranton. The trust names, one beneficiary." He slid a page across the desk. My name was typed in the center of the document in plain 12-point font. "Judith Ann Brewster, sole beneficiary." "The man in the black jacket," I said. Frost almost smiled. "Walter asked me to go in person. He didn't want you waking up alone with nothing but a bill and a whiteboard." My chest tightened. Not the ribs this time, something deeper. My grandfather, who I hadn't seen since I was 17, had made sure that when I woke up broken and alone in a hospital room, someone would be there. Not my parents. Him. The last time I saw my grandfather, I was 17 and he was 63. It was a Sunday in October. He'd driven down from Dunor in his old Ford pickup, the one with the bench seat and the AM radio that only picked up 2 stations to watch me play field hockey, a JV game that didn't matter to anyone except him. After the game, he took me to a diner and ordered us both grilled cheese and tomato soup. And while we ate, he asked me about my classes, my college list, and whether I'd thought any more about nursing school. He listened the way he always listened, leaning forward slightly. one hand wrapped around his coffee mug, not checking his watch, not glancing at the TV above the counter. My grandfather was a machinist. He'd run a small shop in Scranton for 40 years, grinding and turning metal into parts for mining equipment. His hands were scarred and his hearing was shot from decades of lathe noise. But when he talked to me, he was the quietest, most focused person in any room. "Wherever you land, kiddo," he said that day, wiping soup from his chin with a paper napkin. "I'll know how to find you." I didn't understand what he meant. I thought it was just the kind of thing grandfathers say. 3 weeks later, my mother told us Walter was no longer welcome in our home. She said he'd been difficult. She said he'd been interfering. She said it was for the best. My father stood at the kitchen counter and said nothing. And just like that, Walter Brewster disappeared from my life. No goodbye, no explanation that made sense. Just a closed door and a silence that lasted 16 years until a man in a black jacket walked into a hospital and paid my bill. If you're still with me, thank you. I thought about stopping this story a dozen times because some of it still makes my hands shake. But I think somebody listening right now has their own cedar box. Maybe not a literal one, but something you've been afraid to open. Something from someone you lost before you were ready. If that's you, hit subscribe and stay with me because the part that changed everything is next. I sat with the box on Frost's desk for a long time. I ran my thumb over the string the way I'd done every night since the hospital. Frost waited. He didn't rush me. He had been waiting 16 years for this moment, and he seemed perfectly content to wait a few minutes more. Before I opened the box, I called my mother. I sat in Frost's parking lot with the engine running and my rib satching against the seat belt and dialed the number I knew by heart. She picked up on the fourth ring. Judy, not sweetie, not honey, just my name flat like a file label. "Hi, Mom, I'm out of the hospital. I heard." She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask about the surgery or the ribs or the drainage tube they'd pulled out the day before. "Mom, Grandpa Walter died." A pause then, "I know, 3 weeks ago." "Yes." Nobody told me. "Judy, you don't understand what that man put this family through. He was difficult. He made your father's life miserable. We made a decision 16 years ago and it was the right one." Her voice had that clipped, rehearsed quality, the voice she used when the neighbor asked why Walter never came to Christmas anymore. I pressed the phone harder against my ear and felt my ribs flare. A sharp spike of pain that ran from my sternum to my spine like my body was trying to tell me something my brain already knew. "Mom, why did you cut him off?" The real reason. Silence, then quieter. "Don't go digging, Judy. Some things are better left alone, like me in a hospital room." She hung up. I sat there with the phone dark in my lap, breathing through the rib pain and replayed that line. Don't go digging. In my experience as a nurse, when a patient's family says, "Don't ask questions," there's always something in the chart they don't want you to read. I called Aunt Pam that same afternoon. Pam was my father's younger sister, the one who still sent me a birthday card every year with a $20 bill tucked inside. Theane, who always seemed vaguely uncomfortable at family gatherings, like she was sitting on a secret she'd been asked not to share. "Pam, what really happened with Grandpa Walter?" She didn't answer right away. I heard a kitchen timer ding in the background, a chair scraping against tile. "Your mother happened," Pam said finally. "Judy, your grandfather confronted Carol about how things were between you and Megan. About the difference he did it at Thanksgiving 16 years ago in front of the whole table. He said it wasn't right. The way your mother treated you, he called it what it was. What did Mom do? What she always does." She rewrote the story. Pam's voice dropped. Within a month, Carol had told everyone, the neighbors, the church group, Gary's coworkers, that Walter was losing his mind, that he'd become controlling, that he'd threatened her. "None of it was true, Judy." I was there. He didn't raise his voice once. He just stated a fact your mother couldn't tolerate hearing. I pressed my hand against my ribs and breathed. "Did anyone push back?" I tried. "Your father told me to stay out of it, and Walter just went quiet. He stopped calling. He stopped showing up." "But Judy," she paused, and I heard something careful in her voice, something she'd been holding. "He kept things. Letters, cards, things Carol sent back. He kept everything." I I always wondered if somebody would eventually need to see them. Seed planted, roots spreading. I drove back to Frost's office the next morning and opened the box. My hands shook when I untied the string. The paper fell away, and underneath was a wooden box, cedar unfinished, with a hinged lid that my grandfather had clearly built himself. I could see the dovetailed joints, the sanding marks, the faint pencil line where he'd measured twice. Inside, the box was lined with felt. On top, a sealed envelope with my name in my grandfather's handwriting, blocky capital letters, the penmanship of a man who'd worked with tools his whole life. Below the envelope, 16 smaller envelopes, each dated on the outside, one for every year since the cutoff, 2008, 2009, 2010, all the way to 2024. I picked up the first one. It had been opened, then sealed again with tape. "Those are letters he wrote you every year," Frost said from across the desk. "He mailed the first 3. Your mother returned them unopened. After that, he kept writing them but stopped sending them. He said he didn't want to give Carol the satisfaction of sending them back. Below the letters, a slim manila folder. I opened it and found a tuition disbursement record from my nursing school. A scholarship I'd received my sophomore year, the Keystone Healthcare Workers Grant, had been funded by a private trust, Walter's Trust. He'd paid for 2 years of my education through a scholarship I thought came from the school. And at the very bottom of the box, tucked under the folder, a photograph. It was taken at my nursing school graduation 9 years ago. The auditorium, the stage, the rows of folding chairs, and in the last row, standing near the exit, an old man in a black wool jacket, hands clasped in front of him, watching my grandfather. He was there. I opened the sealed envelope on top, one line in those same blocky capitals. "You were never alone, kiddo. I sat in Frost's office for 2 hours reading those letters. 16 years of a one-sided conversation with a granddaughter who never wrote back because she didn't know the conversation existed." The early ones were short updates on his shop, a joke about his neighbor's dog, a line about the weather. But by 2012, the letters had changed. He'd started tracking my life. Judy graduated from St. Anne's nursing program. May 14, 2015. Judy was promoted to charge nurse in the PICU. She was the youngest in the department. Judy moved to a new apartment on Walnut Street, the building with the blue awning. He knew my graduation date. He knew my promotion. He knew my address, not because he was watching from the shadows. Frost explained that Walter had subscribed to the St. Anne's Hospital newsletter, which published staff announcements, and had asked Frost to check public records for address changes once a year. Simple, legal, the kind of quiet due diligence a machinist would engineer. No drama, no confrontation, just careful, patient attention to the data. The tuition records confirmed what Frost had hinted. Walter had funded the Keystone Healthcare Workers Grant through his trust, a $10,000 disbursement each semester for 4 semesters. I'd written a thank you letter to the grant committee my sophomore year. Frost had a copy of it in his files. My grandfather had read it and kept it. $40,000 over 2 years, paid without a word, without credit, without so much as a signature I'd recognize. I put the letters down and looked at Frost. Why didn't he just tell me? He tried. Your mother returned the letters. After that, Walter said the worst thing he could do was force you to choose between him and your parents while you were still a teenager. He decided to wait. The 6th letter, dated 2013, 5 years into the silence, was the one that explained everything. Walter had written it on the anniversary of the Thanksgiving when it all fell apart. He wrote, "I shouldn't have done it at the table. That was my mistake." But I'd watched Carol seat Judy at the far end with the cousins' kids for 2 years running, while Megan sat at the head beside her. I'd watched Carol introduce Megan to visitors as my daughter and Judy as our other one. I'd watched Judy bring a pie she'd baked from scratch, and Carol set it on the counter behind the store-bought one without a word. The letter described what happened next in plain mechanical detail, the way a machinist would document a flaw in a machine. Walter had set his fork down, looked at Carol, and said, "Why does Judy eat with the children?" Carol's face went white. Gary stared at his plate. Megan reached for the wine, and Carol said in front of the whole table, "Because Judy doesn't mind." That was the line. 16 years of silence grew from that single moment, not because Walter had been cruel. Not because he'd threatened anyone, but because he'd named the thing Carol had spent years pretending didn't exist, and he'd named it in front of witnesses. "Your mother couldn't tolerate being seen," Frost said, so she made sure no one would ever listen to Walter again. Within weeks, Carol had called every relative, every neighbor, every member of the church auxiliary. Walter was senile. Walter was controlling. Walter had made threats. By Christmas, Gary had changed the locks and stopped returning his father's calls. Walter spent the next 16 years alone in his house in Dunor, 3 hours from his granddaughter, writing letters to a girl who thought he'd abandoned her. Frost opened a second folder, thicker, older, with a blue cover. "This is the standing instruction file," he said. "Walter drafted the first version in 2012. We updated it every 2 years." The standing instruction was exactly what it sounded like. Walter had written a set of documented, notarized directives that gave Frost authority to act on Judy's behalf in the event of a medical emergency, a financial crisis, or a legal threat. The trigger conditions were specific: hospitalization longer than 24 hours, bankruptcy filing, or a civil judgment exceeding $10,000. If any of those conditions were met, Frost was authorized to liquidate trust assets to cover costs, deliver the cedar box in person, and make contact. He never wanted to intrude. Frost said, "He told me more than once that the worst thing about Carol's campaign was that it worked. You grew up believing he was the one who left. He said if he showed up uninvited, it would only confirm that story." I stared at the folder. How did he know about the crash? "I have a standing alert on your name through a legal monitoring service," Frost said. "Standard tool for estate attorneys managing contingent beneficiaries. Your name appeared in a Pennsylvania State Police accident report on Wednesday evening. I verified the hospital by Thursday morning and drove down Thursday afternoon. Thanksgiving Day." While my mother was carving a turkey and my sister was pouring wine for 24 guests, a 67-year-old lawyer in a black wool jacket was driving 3 hours through sleep to pay my hospital bill and deliver a dead man's box to a woman he'd never met. I picked up the photograph from the graduation. My grandfather standing in the last row, watching. "He saw me," I whispered. Frost nodded. Every milestone he could find, he was always there. It happened on a Thursday 9 days after the crash. I was home, ribs still wrapped, sorting through the last of Walter's letters at my kitchen table when my phone lit up like a switchboard. 3 missed calls from my mother in 12 minutes. 2 from my father the first time he'd called me directly in over a year. 1 from Megan and a text from Carol that read, "We need to talk about Dad's estate. Call me immediately. Not Grandpa, not Walter. Dad's estate." My father's father had been dead for a month, and my mother hadn't mentioned him once. Not to me, not at Thanksgiving, not in the single cold phone call after my surgery. Now suddenly he was Dad again. I set the phone on the table, screen up, and watched the notifications stack. "Carol, Judy, pick up the phone. Carol, this is important. Megan, hey, Mom says there's something about Grandpa's stuff. Can you call her? Gary, Judy, please call your mother." 4 people who hadn't called when I was bleeding on a highway shoulder. 4 people who hadn't called when I was in surgery for 6 hours. 4 people who hadn't called when I woke up alone with a whiteboard that said, "Dine to come." Now, they were blowing up my phone because there was money on the table. I picked up the last voicemail, Carol's voice. And this was the part that made my ribs ache harder than the crash itself. Was warm, sweet. A voice I hadn't heard since I was 12 years old, and she still thought I might turn out like Megan. "Sweetheart, we've been so worried about you. I'm so sorry we couldn't make it to the hospital. Megan's dinner was already planned and we just couldn't reschedule. But we want to make it right. Come home. We're family." I deleted the voicemail. I didn't call back for 3 days. I needed the time not to plan revenge. I want to be clear about that. I'm not a person who builds traps. I'm a PICU nurse. I troubleshoot. I identify the problem. I gather the data and I implement a solution that protects the patient. The patient in this case was me. On Monday, I called Frost. My mother wants me to come to a family dinner. I said she's framing it as a reconciliation, but she mentioned the estate in her first text. I expected that, Frost said. He sounded tired, the way people sound when they've watched a slow car wreck for 16 years. The trust is airtight, Judy. Revocable became irrevocable at Walter's death. You're the sole beneficiary. There's no legal mechanism for your parents to contest it. They were deliberately excluded with a no-contest clause, and the trust was funded years before Walter's death. So there's no basis for undue influence claims. I want you there, I said. At the dinner, Frost paused. Why? Because my mother has spent 16 years telling a story about a man who couldn't defend himself. Now he can. Not with shouting, not with a lawsuit, just with the letters he kept and the truth he documented. I could hear Frost turning something over in his mind. Walter would have hated a scene, he said, but he kept those letters for a reason. And he kept the cards your mother returned. And he kept the church group email where Carol told the congregation he'd been institutionalized, which was a lie. I hadn't known about the email. I'll be there, Frost said. Dinner is Saturday, I told him. My mother's house, extended family. She'll have an audience. So will you. I spent the week preparing the way I prepare for a code blue systematically without emotion, checking every line and every lead. Frost couriered over copies of the key documents, the trust instrument showing me as sole beneficiary, the tuition disbursement records from the Keystone grant, and the returned mail log. A spreadsheet Walter had maintained for 16 years, listing every letter, birthday card, and Christmas gift he'd sent that came back marked return to sender in Carol's handwriting. There were 47 entries, 47 letters and packages my grandfather had sent to me that my mother had intercepted and returned without ever telling me they existed. I also requested a copy of my medical chart from Gissinger, specifically the family contact note from the night of the crash. Dr. Ackerper's handwriting was small and precise. Family notified 6:05. Mother stated, "We will come if she dies, decline to attend. Patient stable post-op." I made 3 copies. I put one in my bag, one in my filing cabinet, and one in an envelope I left with Ranata because PICU nurses always have a backup plan for the backup plan. I didn't rehearse a speech. I didn't write talking points. I didn't fantasize about watching my mother's face crumble. It just organized the evidence the way I'd organize a patient file. Chronological, documented, and clean enough that anyone reading it would reach the same conclusion. My grandfather had loved me quietly for 16 years while my mother had erased him loudly. The documents made that fact inarguable. On Friday night, I ironed a blouse, took 3 ibuprofen for my ribs, and went to bed early. I slept better than I had in weeks. There's a particular kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly what you are going to say and exactly when you're going to say it. Megan called me Saturday morning, 5 hours before the dinner. I was drinking coffee at my kitchen table, the cedar box open beside me. Walter's letters stacked in chronological order. "Judy, I want to talk to you before tonight." Her voice had that bright, managed quality, the voice of a woman who'd been coached. "Look, I know things have been complicated, but Grandpa would have wanted us to be together. He was a family man, and whatever he left behind, it should stay in the family. That's just common sense." Common sense. My sister, who had not called me from the hospital, who had not texted me during my surgery, who had hosted a 24-person Thanksgiving dinner while I was waking up alone with a tube in my side. She was now invoking common sense and family values to explain why I should hand over a dead man's legacy. "Megan, did you know Grandpa died? Mom mentioned it 3 weeks before my crash. Did you think about telling me?" Silence. Then Mom said it wasn't the right time. "The right time for what? Judy, don't make this harder than it has to be. We raised you. Mom and Dad sacrificed. Mom said she'd come if I died. It came out quiet, not angry, just factual, the way I'd stayed a blood pressure reading." I heard Megan's breath catch. That she didn't mean it like that. How did she mean it, Megan? Another silence longer this time. I could hear her swallowing. Just come tonight, she said. We can work this out as a family. I'll be there, I said. And I meant it, but not the way she thought. My father called an hour after Megan. This surprised me. Gary Brewster was not a man who made phone calls. He was a man who stood in the background of family photos with his hands in his pockets and a half smile that never reached his eyes. A man who let his wife do the talking, the planning, the deciding. A man who had let his wife erase his own father from his life and had spent 16 years convincing himself it was the right call. Judy, his voice was different from Carol's and Megan's, thinner. Your mother's planning a nice dinner tonight. She wants to, reconnect. I know what she wants, Dad. A pause. I could hear a TV on low in the background. A football pregame, maybe. Gary in his recliner. I should have called the hospital, he said. The sentence came out like he'd been practicing it for days and still couldn't get it right. When Dana called the nurse, I should have gotten in the car. I know that. I didn't say anything. I let the silence sit. Your grandfather, he said, and then he stopped. I heard him clear his throat. He was a good man, Judy. He was difficult sometimes, but he was a good man, and I should have. His voice broke just for a second. A crack in the wall he'd spent 16 years reinforcing. Then Carol's voice in the background. Gary, who are you talking to? And like that, the crack sealed shut. Just come tonight, he said. Quieter now. Think about your mother. Think about your mother, not think about what's right. Not I'm sorry I let ya wake up alone. Not I miss my father. Think about your mother. I'll be there, Dad. I hung up. After Gary's call, I sat with Walter's last letter, the one dated 3 months before his death, and read it for the 4th time. He'd written it in a shakier hand than the earlier ones, the capital slightly crooked, the pen pressing harder on the downstrokes. Kiddo, he wrote, I'm 79 and the doctor says my heart is slowing down. I'm not scared. I built things my whole life, machines, parts, joints that held under pressure. The one thing I built that I'm proudest of is you. Even though you don't know it yet, this money isn't a prize. It's a foundation. I didn't save it so you could buy a house or retire early. I saved it so you could do the thing you were always going to do anyway. Take care of people without ever having to wonder if anybody was taking care of you. Use it however you want. But if you're looking for a suggestion, find the kids who don't have somebody in the last row. Be their last row. I set the letter down. I knew what I was going to do with the estate before I finished reading. Not because Walter told me to, but because he'd described the exact shape of the hole I'd carried my entire life, and he'd handed me away to fill it for someone else. The Walter Brewster Fund. Scholarships for first-generation nursing students. Kids who got into the program on their own merits, but didn't have a family cheering in the front row. Kids like me 20 years ago who thought a mysterious grant was just good luck and never imagined it was love in disguise. I folded the letter and put it back in the box. Tonight I'd walk into my mother's house carrying nothing but a bag of documents and the truth. That was enough. That had always been enough. The drive to Dunor was 3 hours. Same road, same mountains, same stretch of Route 15, where my Camry had hit the guardrail 2 weeks ago. The rental car, a gray Nissan that smelled like air freshener and prior regret, handled fine. The roads were dry. The sky was overcast but clear. My ribs ached with a low, dull pulse, nothing like the shattered glass feeling from the hospital, more like a bruise now. A reminder that was losing its sharpness, the way pain does when you stop bracing against it and start breathing through it instead. I drove past the accident site without stopping. There was a fresh scar on the guard rail, a silver scrape against the rust where my car had folded, but someone had already placed a reflector cone beside it, and life had moved on. I thought about Walter making the same drive year after year alone in his Ford pickup, 3 hours each way, just to stand in the back of an auditorium or a stadium or a church parking lot and watch from a distance. Never approaching, never demanding recognition, just being there quietly, the way a foundation holds up a building without anyone noticing it's there. You are never alone, kiddo. His handwriting swam in front of my eyes, and I had to pull over at a rest stop near Williamsport to wipe my face and drink some water and let my ribs stop throbbing. I was not going to walk into my mother's house with red eyes. I was going to walk in the way I walk into a code blue, calm, prepared, and clear about what needed to happen next. At 5:47 p.m., I pulled into my parents' driveway. 8 cars, full house. Carol had invited the whole family. I picked up my bag, checked the documents one more time, and got out of the car. My mother answered the door in a cream-colored sweater and pearl earrings, her hair freshly set, her smile wide enough to sell real estate. "Judy, oh, sweetheart, come in." She pulled me into a hug carefully because even Carol Brewster knew better than to squeeze a woman with broken ribs, and over her shoulder I could see the dining room. The 24-seat table was set for 12 tonight. White linen, the good china, a centerpiece of autumn leaves and miniature pumpkins that Megan had probably found on Pinterest. Aunt Pam was in the kitchen drying a serving dish. She caught my eye and gave me a small nod, the kind of nod that said, "I know why you're here." 2 of my cousins, Tyler and Bridget, were on the couch with their phones. Megan was pouring wine at the sideboard, and her fiancé Derek was making small talk with my father, who stood near the fireplace with his hands in his pockets looking like a man who wanted to be anywhere else. Frost was not here yet. He had told me he'd arrive at 6, 15 minutes after me, enough time for Carol to settle into her performance before the curtain went up. "You look thin," Carol said, steering me toward the living room. "We need to get some food in you." Megan made her butternut soup. Her hand was on my elbow, guiding me the way she'd always guided me toward the seat she'd chosen at the end of the table she'd set in the version of the family she'd scripted. "Actually, Mom," I said, "I'd like to wait until everyone's seated." She blinked. "Of course, sweetheart." She was still smiling. She had no idea what was in my bag. She had no idea Frost was 12 minutes away, and she had no idea that the woman standing in her foyer was not the same Judy who'd driven home for Thanksgiving 2 weeks ago. We sat down at 6:10. Carol had placed me between Megan and Aunt Pam. A strategic choice, I realized, designed to keep me flanked by family loyalty. The butternut soup was served. Grace was said, by Carol, who thanked God for bringing her family back together the way it should be. Megan squeezed my arm. Derek complimented the table setting. My father said nothing. The doorbell rang at 6:15. I stood up. "That's for me," I said. Carol's eyes narrowed just for a second before the smile snapped back into place. I opened the front door and Daniel Frost stepped in, black wool jacket over a pressed shirt carrying a leather briefcase. "This is Daniel Frost," I said, Grandpa Walter's attorney. The table went still. Megan set her wine glass down. Gary looked at his plate. Aunt Pam folded her hands. Carol recovered first, she always did. "How nice," she said, her voice bright. "Please sit down, we have plenty." Frost sat. Carol served him soup. And then, while everyone was eating and the small talk was filling the room like gas before a match, Carol made her move. She set her spoon down, reached across the table, and took my hand. "Judy, your father and I have been talking about Grandpa Walter's estate." She paused for effect, scanning the table to make sure everyone was listening. We know Walter left some things behind, and we think as a family the right thing to do is to share them. Walter was a family man. He wouldn't have wanted one person to inherit everything while the rest of us were left out. She looked at Frost, then back at me. It's what he would have wanted. I let her finish. I let the room absorb her version of events, and then I reached into my bag. I set the stack of letters on the table beside my soup bowl. 16 envelopes yellowed at the edges, each one dated in Walter's block of handwriting. "These are letters Grandpa Walter wrote me," I said. "One every year for 16 years. The table was silent. Carol's hand was still extended toward mine, frozen in mid-reach. He mailed the first 3. "Mom, you returned them." I wasn't looking at Carol when I said it. I was looking at Aunt Pam and at Tyler and Bridget and at Derek, the witnesses. After that, he stopped mailing them, but he kept writing. I opened the 2013 letter and read 2 sentences aloud. The ones about the Thanksgiving table, about Megan sitting at the head and me eating with the cousins' kids. About Walter setting his fork down and asking a question that cost him his family. Why does Judy eat with the children? Pam pressed her hand to her mouth. Bridget looked at her phone, then put it face down. Carol opened her mouth, but I kept going. I placed the tuition records on the table. Grandpa paid for 2 years of my nursing school through a private trust. I didn't know until last week. Then I placed the returned mail log beside it. 47 letters and gifts sent over 16 years. All returned by you, Mom, in your handwriting. And then I placed the chart note, Dr. Ockhapper's small, precise handwriting on Jasinger Medical Center letterhead. This is from the night of my car crash. The charge nurse called you at 6:00 a.m. to tell you your daughter was in emergency surgery. I read it aloud, steady, the way I'd read a lab result to a parent in the PICU. Factual, calm, no inflection. Family notified. 6:05. Mother stated, we will come if Shetty's. Declined to attend. Patient stable post-op. The room didn't gasp. It didn't erupt. It just went very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when 12 people are all holding their breath at the same time and nobody wants to be the first to exhale. Carol broke first. Her chair scraped back and she stood up, hands flat on the table, and the cream sweater and the pearl earrings and the Pinterest centerpiece suddenly looked like a costume that didn't fit anymore. This is your twist and everything, she said. Her voice climbed. Walter was unstable. He was controlling. He tried to turn this family against me, and I did what any mother would do. I protected my children. From what? Aunt Pam said quietly from the other end of the table. Carol's head snapped toward her. From a man who couldn't mind his own business. He asked why Judy ate with the children. Carol, that's all he did. He humiliated me in front of my own family. Carol's mask slipped, and what was underneath wasn't grief or fear. It was rage. 16 years of maintained narrative crumbling in front of the people she'd spent 16 years convincing. She turned to me. You've always been like this, dramatic, difficult. You think because he left you money that makes you special. He poisoned you against us, Judy. He was a bitter old man who couldn't let go. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand up. I stayed in my chair with my hands folded and my ribs aching and my voice as level as a flatline. Frost, I said. Frost opened his briefcase. The trust is irrevocable, he said. Judith is the sole named beneficiary. Walter excluded all other family members by name with a no contest clause. Any attempt to challenge the trust results in automatic forfeit of any residual claim. The documents have been filed with the Lackawanna County Surrogates Court. Carol stared at Frost, then at me, then back at Frost. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set. You planned this, she whispered. No, I said. Grandpa did. I stood up, not fast, not angry. The way you stand up when a shift is over and you've done everything you can. You said you'd come if I died. I lived. We're done. Nobody moved for about 5 seconds. Then Aunt Pam pushed her chair back and walked around the table to stand beside me. She didn't say a word. She just stood there, a witness choosing a side, the way witnesses do when the evidence is clear. Tyler followed, then Bridget. Megan stayed seated, her wine glass untouched, staring at the stack of letters like they were a math problem she couldn't solve. Derek studied the tablecloth. Carol's performance shifted. The rage melted into tears, not the quiet kind. The loud, shoulders shaking, gasping kind that fills a room and demands attention. The kind designed to make everyone stop what they're doing and comfort the person crying. How could you do this to me? She said, dabbing her eyes with her linen napkin. I gave you everything. I raised you. And this issue you repay me in front of everyone. I'd seen this before in the PICU when a parent who'd been neglecting a child for months suddenly started sobbing the moment social services showed up. The tears were real. The grief was real, but it wasn't grief for the child. It was grief for the version of the story that was no longer believable. My father hadn't moved. He sat in his chair at the head of the table, hands in his lap, staring at the letters. His lips were pressed together and his chin trembled, just once, a single involuntary quiver, and I knew he was thinking about his father. About 23 years of phone calls he could have made and didn't, about a funeral he attended and a granddaughter he didn't bother to tell. He didn't apologize, he didn't stand up, he didn't say a word. That silence was its own kind of answer. Megan finally spoke. "So there's nothing we can do legally." Frost shook his head. "The trust is final." Megan picked up her wine and drank. I gathered the letters and put them back in the cedar box. 16 years of a conversation I never knew I was having, written by a man I never knew was listening. The box felt different now, lighter somehow. The way a suitcase feels lighter on the trip home because you've left the heaviest thing behind. I picked up my phone from the table. No new messages, no missed calls. For 2 weeks, that blank screen had been an indictment. Proof that nobody cared enough to call. Now it was something else. I turned it face down on the table and left it there for a beat, letting Carol see it, letting the room see it. Then I picked it up and put it in my pocket. The silence was mine now. "Aunt Pam," I said, "thank you." She squeezed my arm. "Frost, I'll call you Monday about the fund." He nodded. I looked at my mother one last time. She was sitting in her chair, napkin twisted in her hands, mascara tracking down both cheeks, surrounded by the Thanksgiving table she'd spent 16 years building. The china, the linen, the centerpiece, the narrative, all of it intact except the thing that mattered. The truth about who she really was. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. I walked out through the front door and into the November dark, and the cold air hit my face and my ribs zonked one more time. A sharp, clean ache, like a stitch being pulled, like something closing. And then the ache softened, the way it does when the healing has finally started and your body knows it before your brain does. 6 weeks later, I sat in Frost's office and signed the papers establishing the Walter Brewster Fund. The trust had been substantial, not a fortune, but a machinist's lifetime of careful saving and smart investing. Enough to endow an annual scholarship for first-generation nursing students at 3 Pennsylvania schools, with a preference for applicants who, in the language Frost and I drafted together, demonstrate resilience in the absence of family support. Frost framed Walter's graduation photograph and hung it in his office. I kept the cedar box on my nightstand. Some mornings I open it and read one of the letters. Not all of them, just one. The way you'd revisit a conversation with someone you love. The first scholarship was awarded in March to a 20-year-old woman from Allentown who'd been in foster care since she was 12. She didn't know who funded the grant. She wrote a thank you letter to the committee, and I read it in Frost's office and thought about the thank you letter I'd written 10 years ago to a scholarship committee that was just my grandfather sitting alone at his kitchen table reading my words and putting them in a folder. My mother called once 3 weeks after the dinner. I didn't pick up. My father never called. Megan sent a text that said we should talk, and I replied I don't think we should. Aunt Pam and I had dinner every other week. She told me stories about Walter I'd never heard. How he'd built the cedar box in his shop over the course of a year, sanding the joints until they were seamless. How he'd told Pam once that the box was for Judy when the time comes. My ribs healed. The scars faded to thin white lines along my left side. By February, I could take a full breath without wincing. A deep, clean inhale that filled my lungs completely. And every time I did it, I thought about Walter's last letter, and the line that lived now like a pulse underneath everything I did. "You were never alone, kiddo. Neither were they now. I used to think family meant the people who share your last name and your dinner table and your blood. I was wrong. Family is the person standing in the last row of your graduation in a black wool jacket, watching, saying nothing, and making sure you'll never fall without someone there to catch you. That's my story. One crash, one sentence I'll never unhear, and one quiet man who never stopped showing up. If this reminded you of someone who loved you from a distance, or if it reminded you to be that person for somebody else, tell them today. And if someone you know needs to hear this, share it with them. Thank you for being here. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next.